And this one's an important one. They're all important, but supply chain is talked about so much. So I'm really excited to hear specifically how a supply chain has affected the food industry. And with us today, moderating this panel is Kathy Fulton, who is the executive director with Allen. And Kathy, if you could tell us a little bit more about you and Allen and introduce us to your prestigious panel today.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So I'm grateful to be here and excited to once again partner with All Hazards on this event. So Allen, or American Logistics Aid Network, is a nonprofit focused on really helping to build supply chain resilience. And we do that in a couple of different ways, both working with nonprofit organizations to help them access private sector logistics and supply chain resources, but also working with the business and government communities to help build that understanding and be that bridge. With me today, I have an amazing panel. I'll ask them to go ahead and come off camera if they have not already. I'm not going to try to introduce them because they can do a much better job of that themselves. But we will start just as they are listed: Doug, then Carmela, then Don, then Jean. So Doug, go ahead.
Thank you, Kathy, and appreciate everybody. Appreciate being here. Doug Baker with FMI, the Food Industry Association. So we're a not-for-profit trade organization that represents grocers from single store operators up to multi-state, multinational, as well as product manufacturers and any company that wants to do business with them. And we work across three key areas: advocacy, food safety, and then what I call the business of the business. So I have the pleasure of working very closely with Don and Carmela on some pretty critical issues that we're going to talk about today.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Go ahead, Carmela.
Hi, everyone. Carmela Hinderaker. I'm the Senior Director of Business Continuity and Customer Support at CNS Wholesale Grocers. So CNS Wholesale Grocers delivers groceries to grocery stores. So we work with the manufacturers like Kraft and PepsiCo, and then we work with customers such as who Don represents, the grocery stores. And we are a national company, so we do service both coasts, and we go as far as Alaska, Guam, and Puerto Rico.
Great. Thanks, Carmela. Don.
Okay, I'll just jump in there, make sure that you can hear me because I've got a lot of buttons to push and it looks like the green light is on. So Don Lynn, I'm the Director of Crisis Management and Business Continuity at Albertsons Companies. We're in 34 states and DC. We are also a supplier and have retail in Alaska and Hawaii. But I'm a grocer. I'm a pharmacist, not personally, but a pharmacy. We do 4 walls, no walls, e-commerce, curbside, delivery, all those things that you've heard, especially in the last 3 years. I have my own distribution supply chain with my own fleet of trucks, and I'm also a manufacturer. 4 of my lines are billion-dollar businesses. So just a small player in the big works here. Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are today.
Yeah, thanks, Don. And last but certainly not least, Gene Shearer with FEMA.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Gene Shearer. I am the supply chain advisor for the FEMA Logistics Management Directorate. I focus on consumer supply chains as opposed to the federal supply chain, and doing everything we can to first do no harm, and second of all, to restore the flow after disasters.
Thanks, Gene. Well, we have certainly seen no shortage of disruptions over the past 3 years, certainly since the beginning of COVID, to our food supply chains. For some of us, it goes back even further. We can talk about Puerto Rico and all of those things as well. But I guess just for our audience today, let's talk about the here and now. Let's talk about kind of what challenges is the food sector facing as we sit here on January 24th, 2023. And then looking back a little bit, how have your organizations responded? What changes have you made to your supply chains? How are you addressing these challenges head on? And I'm actually going to start with Carmela, if that's okay.
Yeah, so some of the challenges that we're facing today from the wholesaler perspective, I don't know if it will be surprising to anyone in the audience, but we are still kind of trying to climb our way back from the big impacts from COVID 2020, when a lot of the manufacturer facilities shut down, grocery stores became a really big one point of source for food. The mix of items that customers or consumers at the stores wanted started to change. People were staying at home more, so kind of fresh items were not really what they were looking for. And so over the past couple of years, we've slowly been climbing back to what we would say is pre-COVID service levels or items with the completion of orders from our customers. But we're still facing the same things that are now kind of external economic factors. So there's still kind of labor issues that we're facing. So some of the things that within my company we've looked at concerning labor is expanding the pool of candidates for some that are typically office work, kind of really looking at fully remote environments now that everyone does Zoom meetings or Zoom conferences. And then also trying to do incentives or look at pay increases, because the grocery industry is a very highly competitive market. And so if my competitor literally down the street is paying more for a selector, then I need to meet that market rate as well. The other thing that's also just been going on with the industry is just because it's highly competitive, there's always kind of like merging or acquisitions, or like a new competitor comes in. So, you know, I'm reading news about how the dollar stores are kind of now getting more into different food items. So that's one more competitor that I need to think about besides just the chains or your local mom and pop stores that are in your neighborhood. And then lastly, as I mentioned, just kind of related to staffing, there were some issues that were there before COVID. Transportation, particularly drivers, that was always something that this industry was kind of suffering from. It's a job description where, you know, it's hard work. You're kind of away from your family for very long periods of time. And then separately, you're also kind of hearing about innovation about driverless vehicles. And so again, with COVID and then the stuff that we're facing from the external market, it has just been hard to kind of fulfill that type of job.
Yeah, so some really significant challenges and headwinds that the industry is facing. Don, anything on the retail side that differs or adds to that?
I don't think it differs, and you probably will find that we have more in common than we have different. But you know, it's obvious. You know, we're seeing some relief from the pandemic, right? But it's not over, because we're still dealing with issues in the background of that. We've got problems with the global supply chains, not only on the retail food and pharmacy areas, but we just know even getting chips for technology, and that impacts us because it slows down our ability to deploy that technology. Demand is up. People want a lot of things, and they want it now. So we're seeing the impacts of inflation, and we're either sometimes viewed as causing it because we're raising prices, or you know, we're in there somewhere in different people's minds. But it also impacts us because it impacts us with wages and other things. And then there's the the unstableness of the political and social environment, both in the U.S. and abroad. So, but it's interesting as we kind of look at what's going on. Reality, though, is that we've had 3 straight years of COVID. But I ended 2021 and 2022 with urban fires. I ended 2022 and 2023 with atmospheric rivers. So that was the rain, snow, and flooding. But then we have the day-to-day issues, which is what we experienced with proteins. Pork isn't available, beef is, prices are going up. Let's bring out more fish and trying to stay ahead of that. Then we see things like bird flu and the impact on eggs and the price of eggs that we all pay, which is there. And of course, the labor shortages have been around for a while. They continue. And the more people want, the more that we need people to help serve our customers. and then the other things that are kind of rearing their head, and this is almost the things that are starting to cause me sleeplessness, is the changing cycle of disasters, cyber impact, potential out there, especially in areas of automation. It's one thing to have a manual process and you know how to restore that manual process, but when you have automation involved, it brings in a whole new complexity of things that we have to do, and the attacks on the electrical substation. So, food safety is big to me. I can't keep food in a proper temperature if I don't have electricity, and that's not only at my DCs, but at the retail level. So we certainly want to not do any harm to our customers while fulfilling all their needs. But, I also look at it as kind of the opportunities that we have. We have an
Don, let's hold the opportunities for a moment, and let's give Doug and Jean a chance to weigh in on this. So Doug, why don't you go next and talk about it from an industry perspective?
Yeah, boy, these guys really ticked off the list. And it was a lot of the things that we've been working on. So people listening are probably going, holy cow, there's a lot of issues in the grocery industry. And there are a lot of needs to be addressing. But from a national level too, we're also looking at significant regulation. As a result of some of these activities that are going on. I would say probably the biggest issue that we'll be addressing for the next 3 years is traceability. And that was primarily driven because of the several recalls that we've experienced over the last few years, whether it be leafy greens or formula. The FDA has put out the final rule for FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act, and this is Rule 204. So haven't had a lot of conversation with Don or Carmela, but I have been talking to a lot of their colleagues, and we're all sort of scratching our head as to how we're going to pull this off, because it's basically tracing the supply chain all the way back to the farm, which is going to have its own inherent challenges. So that's a big one. And then the last one I would mention is soft target attacks. So the increase on targets on our stores and our parking lots, due to the, just the increased stress from consumers, due to the increased homelessness. New York, their homelessness is up 50%. That's significant. And so those individuals find their ways to our parking lots and our stores, and we want to help them, but they also have sometimes become destructive in the process. So those are a couple of other things.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Yeah, like I said at the beginning, no shortage of challenges that our industry is facing, right? Jean, I guess, you're not directly dealing with these challenges, but you are in a role that is, supposed to support the continuity of supply chains. How do you respond? What are you seeing from a trends perspective?
Yeah, I think that Don kind of listed and Carmela kind of listed the things that are really affecting our ability to do our job here at FEMA are the disasters, and specifically the non-Stafford Act disasters. So as you know, the Stafford Act is what gives us our authorities and our ability to spend money in the DRF, the Disaster Relief Fund. But we've been asked to respond to a lot of smaller disasters that don't reach the threshold of a major disaster. And that puts a tremendous strain on us. And those could be anything from, the atmospheric river to snowstorms, to all of these events that you're hearing about, flooding, the Mississippi, river going down, now it's back up. A lot of these things we're focused on, but don't have the funding to respond to yet. The administration is on the phone to FEMA every day. So we're constantly trying to do our best to meet the needs of the survivors for these smaller disasters without reaching the threshold of a major disaster. That's a big challenge to us. We also see a lot with climate change. It's hard to talk about drought conditions when you just had what just happened in California, but there still is a drought. And the Columbia River is still drying up. And so most of our food production that you have in like Fresno County, California, that they say an American citizen doesn't eat 1 day's worth of food without consuming something potentially that was grown there. it's going to stress our system of where food is actually produced. And that's also a big item that we have on our radar.
So I think we've hit it kind of end to end, everything from, in-store type of challenges all the way to global challenges. We know that there are no shortage of crises occurring at any one time. So I guess I'm just kind of curious, and Don, maybe this is where the opportunity response comes in. How are you ensuring continuity despite all of this? And then if each of you, just because we have such a diverse audience, if each of you could just take a moment at the end of your response to talk about how do you personally decompress and step away from the fray, because I know that that's been something really important for all of us over the past 3 years. So how are you ensuring continuity for your business, and how are you ensuring that you can continue to show up for work? Doug, I actually want to start with you on this one, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Again, from a national level for a trade association, it's really having plans and a clear understanding of roles and responsibilities, right? So for us, what is our role as a trade association? To support the members as well as the private sector, and typically that's a liaison. And then to exercise those plans as often as possible. And they sort of relate to, how quickly can we get waivers issued, both from the federal and state governments, re-entry, all of the things that Carmela and Don are going to need in order to continue to run their businesses. But then also in Blue Sky Days is working on how do we ensure that those things are more seamless and almost secondhand. They just become a part of a process. So that's a lot of the work that we do. And for me, decompressing means getting away from technology, the 24-hour news cycle, and getting my hands dirty on my property in West Virginia just allows me to get away and then come back ready to go again.
Yeah, that's perfect. Great answer. Don, jump in here. Tell us.
Well, I'll kind of start off with the opportunities because it's also part of my basics. And number one, I think we're learning that we also need to be better stewards of what we have on many different fronts. But it's still about people and being mindful of their needs. And people is your employees. It is your customers. It's the community at large, and then there's the global community, and just making sure that that they're taken care of. There's the liaison that Doug kind of mentioned, kind of kicked off a thought that there's always something going on somewhere, and I've got a small team, and it really says that I need to reach out and look at my partners and on a couple of fronts. One is kind of on the emergency management front, and the other is as my partners in the food industry. But I'll just share something about the difficulty of the liaison and the problem it presents to plants. I've got a small team, and we know that all disasters are local. We've learned that. And let's just make the county level our local level for the sake of discussion, and not the 108,000 cities that we have in the US. But if you have 3,000 counties and parishes, it would take me 5.1 years nonstop to spend 30 minutes with each one of them. So it's not easy. How do you do that planning ahead? So you try to tackle it at the larger level and then drive it down as local as you can. And again, there's always something going on. During the atmospheric river, I had power outages and snow falling in other parts of the country. I'm not just in one city. I'm not just in one county. I'm in 34 states and DC. There's then kind of moving off to, we've got to work together. We've got to partner together, but then we kind of look at things that I kind of call important lessons that I've learned. You can't take care of others if you don't take care of yourself. You have to constantly take care of your team. Ask them how they're doing. My team gets sometimes exasperated at me because I always remind them to stay hydrated and never miss a bathroom stop. And that's not an age thing. When you're out in a disaster, those things are important. And they don't teach that in disaster school. It's taken a long time to realize that. But the fact is that everyone needs to decompress, even if it's just daily mindless TV. And I'm not talking about a documentary. I'm talking about Three Stooges type stuff. At least 30 to 60 minutes. You have to take kind of a big game approach. Now, just personally, how do I kind of decompress? Well, I've been doing this long enough. Retirement is a career goal. So I do kind of plan that retirement a little bit more. I listen to old time radio programs. I'm very involved in amateur radio, but I stay away from response of amateur radio. I do the fun part of it. And then oftentimes, because you don't have technology, it's jigsaw puzzles. By the way, I don't do any more than 500 pieces because then it becomes part of the problem. So that's kind of my feed for that
Great.
question.
Thanks, Don. I always pick up at least one piece of wisdom anytime I talk with Don, and I think mine for today may just be never miss a bathroom break. Carmela, over to you. How do you keep your continuity for your organization? I know your responsibility personally is very big for the organization, and you have a small team as well.
Correct. Yeah. So besides me, there's only one other full-time employee within CNS Wholesale Grocers that also does business continuity. And we watch when we're monitoring for threats, it's not just the domestic United States. We are looking internationally to see what else could affect our supply chain. So it is a big, heavy lift. Besides doing monitoring and responding, we're also doing the planning for the company as well. But kind of going towards the question about how do we handle multiple crises that's happening, it does, as Don had mentioned before, it does seem like in the past 2 to 3 years, there is significantly more events. And I think from a company perspective, some of the things that CNS put into place is helping us try and combat that, which is, we're finding new partners or new vendors that we didn't really have in that particular region. We're also putting in new technology, which helps us manage our volume better and pushing it down for selection or doing ordering with customers. So we're having that kind of basic, how do you continue to plan better? But I think from a business continuity perspective, what Katie and I have done in the past 8 years that I've been there is really the archiving of information and knowledge. People move around within the company, people leave the company. We do have a very good, I would say, historical kind of archive where we can say, hey, right now, currently we're watching the West Coast port negotiations. And it was like, oh, they did this 4 or 5 years ago. It did require that a federal mediator came in. It took X number of months for it to do it. So as we were going into this one, it's it's going to take a few months. We know that, and we'll see how bad it's going to be if we start seeing the federal mediation come in. So I think sharing information between regions, especially anything with historical knowledge, is helpful. And then as to how do I personally decompress, I'm also like Don. I am really big about self-care. So I try and put that into my schedule as well. I think it's really important to have a good backup team member. So as I mentioned, I only have one other person, but Katie and I, we throw our responsibilities back and forth, and we're really good at transitioning. So I feel comfortable to say, well, you know what, I'm going to be out for this weekend. I'm going to do what Doug does, and you can't get me, I'm off the grid. But I know she can handle it, and she knows where everything is. And separately, I think it's also important to have good backup in your personal life. So I'm married and have young kids. And so if I need to decompress, it's please handle these children. I'm going to go walk away right now. So I think it's important, again, to just kind of have a good coworker teammate that can kind of take everything that you have, and then separately on a personal level, having a partner of some sort or a family member who can kind of support you on the personal responsibility side.
Great. Thanks, Carmela. Yeah, I love the comment about archiving the knowledge because there's nothing new under the sun. We've been here before. Let's learn from what we've observed. All right, Jean, I think I'm coming to you last yet again, but you're dealing with crisis every single day. It's kind of emergency management is in the title of your organization. How are you handling the multiple crises, and how do you personally decompress?
Well, it kind of starts with when I saw who was going to be on this panel. So I've kind of had relationships. Probably most of you have fostered a relationship with me, and I hope that I've reciprocated in that. I visited Dawn's DC up in Upper Marlboro. I've been up to Carmela's DC distribution center up in Bel Air. I've been over to Doug. I've been over to FMI, and Kathy, I think I'm on the line with you one way or another most weeks. So I think that in dealing with the crises that are ongoing, there's always something out there that you don't see in the normal news cycle. Even if you're watching Bloomberg 24/7, you miss something. And I'll get one of the leaders will come and say, hey, did you know about this? And I'll say, no, I don't know about that, but I will find out. And by reaching out to people like you and many others, when we're not in a full-blown disaster, to kind of get your perspective, that helps us deal with the ongoing crises, be they small or large. And then for kind of trying to maintain sanity, I think trying to be connected with my maker, trying to be a good husband and father, and spending as much time in those relationships outside of work is how I kind of deal with what goes on in work.
Yeah, we actually had someone comment in the chat that we can't teach or we have to teach balance, that it doesn't come naturally, and other folks are really enjoying, you all being vulnerable. So sorry to put you on the spot with that question, but I know it's always a challenge for those of us who are dealing with crisis every day. And so I hope your comments are helpful to others. I know they are to me. I think each of you in some way mentioned partnership and relationships, and we need those. Especially in supply chain. Supply chain is an ecosystem. We could not function without our partners. So I want to ask you guys just a kind of a practical question, and that's what makes for a good partnership. Jean, I'm going to start with you here.
Caught me off guard. So I was used to going last. So yeah, I think it's relationships, like you said, knowing people and trying to, get to know them a little better. You might not see them often, but establishing those relationships so when we have a shortage of baby formula, I can pick up the phone and call Doug Baker. Or when we need to know about how a certain transportation situation is affecting the distribution of food into New York City, I can pick up the phone and call Carmela or her trusty sidekick, Katie. And Dawn's always involved in discussions on the food as far as what's going on with that ecosystem. So I think having those relationships. One other thing I'd like to talk about with relationships, the Office of Business, Industry, and Infrastructure Integration here at FEMA. So OB3I, I partner with them. Sammy Brunson is the new director there. And many of you participate as an active member with them in the NBEOC, the National Business Emergency Operations Center, and the calls that they have. In fact, they have one that is starting in 5 minutes that I'm going to miss because of this panel. So, and it's a stakeholder call. So we appreciate the participation of key private sector entities on those calls. That really helps us get a sense of what's going on in the private sector and consumer supply chains, and helps us try to deal with those situations because of the relationships that we work to establish. Not perfect, but we're trying to get better each and every day.
Great. Thanks, Jean. Doug, you want to take this one next?
Sure. I would add just a couple more words to that. I agree. Relationships are really, what we know in the grocery industry at the end of the day is about relationships. And I think that's really across all of our lives. But mutual goals, right? Having aligned mutual goals, I think, is another really important thing, which is pretty easy to consider when you're talking about a crisis and we're trying to take care of communities. The last word I would use is transparency. We all have our individual goals, especially in this industry. We're fierce competitors. That's the benefit that the U.S. consumer gets, is that grocers compete against each other. But when the crisis happens, we come together and we unify together. And it's important to be able to transparently share information between the public sector and private sector so that everybody can be making the decisions necessary to get to the end goal, which must also be mutual.
Yeah, Doug, I know FMI has been doing a lot of work on the transparency side of things. So kudos to you guys for pushing towards that. Carmela, I'm gonna ask you this same question about relationships and partnerships, and what makes a good one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to kind of mimic the same thing with Doug and Jean. It really is based on relationships. I didn't mention earlier, but I used to be a former emergency manager. And so when I worked in New York City, it was always kind of this phrase of, we shouldn't be exchanging business cards at the time of the event. And so it's really important for me to really have these relationships and discussions outside of an event. So like looking at everyone you can see on this panel, I literally know everyone for many years now that I'm looking at it. And so it is kind of nice to see kind of the same faces. And again, some people might have moved around within the emergency management business continuity field, but you kind of still come in with the same, I guess, culture. You know what's important. There are things that are high pressure, what to focus on. I think the second thing is, and Doug kind of mentioned it with transparency, but I would say like commitment and having a little bit of realism. So, I know if I go to Jean and I ask for something, I'm going to at least get a response. It may not be something that I like, but I know he's going to respond back to me. And similarly on the other side, like people can ask me a question about what CNS can do, and I can say, you know what, that's just something we can't do right now. But there are definitely some players out in the field where it's like, we maybe met once and then I don't hear from them again. And so as Don mentioned, there are thousands of counties and thousands of public sector partners I could have. There's only so much that I can really kind of keep having that relationship grow. So really thinking about what's realistic and are you committed to really trying to have these relationships outside of just a real world event?
Yeah, that's terrific, Carmela. Don, you get to back clean up on this question.
All right. Well, first off, this isn't my first sector either. I was in law enforcement. I was in emergency management, power and telephone industries, and so public and private. But I continue to marvel that in some of those other settings, I seem to be on the inside. When I worked for the telephone company and when I worked for the power company, I'm just picking more of the private sector companies. But now that I'm in private sector food, I still fight battles because I'm only a grocer. So the things I would say, you trust until you can't. You value other people's knowledge in their area of expertise, and always keep the big picture in sight. I know where you're coming from on the public sector. I've been there, and we can have a conversation so that we can work for that common good. That's a partnership. I'll kind of close with one quick story. I recall being asked by an agency to help in a particular situation, and this is in my current role in food. And I asked for one small piece of clarifying information. And I remember being told, we have that information, but we can't share it with you. I think that just kind of sums up the brick walls that sometimes we hit our heads against. So with that, I'll just kind of turn it back to you and wait for the next question.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've heard, Don, you and Carmela both talk about previously is not just the private-public relationships that exist, but also the private-private, and Doug, jump in here as well. I think someone described it, and probably Don, because you always have the great sayings, throwing rocks at the problem and not each other, right? So maybe the three of you guys just want to talk about that a little bit, about how you're working even across competitors during times of crisis.
I'll start because I can give a
Yeah, great.
and then maybe those two can talk about specific. This has been for me, I've been in the grocery industry since I was 17 years old, and I was an operator up until I came to FMI, which now I sort of see myself as in between it. The most fascinating thing that I've seen in this industry is how competitors come together to offer mutual aid. The minute a crisis hits, we have CEOs reaching out to CEOs from impacted area to non-impacted area. We have Don and Carmela that are collaborating together to make sure that the response is accurate. So it's to me, it's those partnerships. And we just came back from our midwinter executive conference in Florida for 4 days, where every executive across the industry, from retail to manufacturing, we're sitting and talking about the big, hairy issues that we've got to deal with and the big opportunities that we got to deal with. And they were setting aside their competitive, desires to be the best at it. We'll go back to our offices and we'll do that. But I think it's just really amazing to me to see that, because, unity is what gets us through most of these crises and any other challenge that we've faced in this country. So, and I think this industry does a really good job of it.
Yeah, go ahead, Don.
I'll just go ahead and jump in there. A competition can actually make you better. From a price perspective, from a process. I read what the other people are doing, and I was just looking at the driver shortage, and someone is starting up their own driving school where any employee can now become a truck driver. And I thought that was neat. I wrote it down. I don't mind borrowing great ideas, so I think we need to look at it. But throwing rocks at the problem and then not each other. And it was interesting because I would say prior to COVID, we didn't quite have some of our the same relationships in the emergency management part of our companies as we have now, because we had to get together. We had common issues, and it's really about pulling our own weight. We could look at things from a competitive advantage standpoint. But I'd much rather say, hey, if I'm in a town, there could be a Walmart, there could be, the local grocery store. I have a certain share of the market. During a disaster, I just need to carry my own weight, add some more to it if I can, but basically deliver the stuff that I do every day. So, and there's many other examples that we have in the food industry where we're saying, we have common issues. Instead of getting upset at each other, let's pick up some rocks and throw up at the things that are causing us sleepless nights or a greater shrink. Things like the crime, the shoplifting, organized crime is real big right now. Soft laws, smarter bad actors, and then we have the disasters. I mean, the disasters is nobody's friend. We don't look at it as, oh, we might sell a little bit more water or sell a little bit more ice. It's bad things. We see it from people losing homes or getting inconvenienced or being evacuated for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. I wouldn't want to go through it, and certainly don't wish it for them. And what can we do to help and support our communities, our customers, or our employees? Again, getting back to the people. It's always about people. If you focus there, then the solutions are obvious.
Great. And Carmela, any last words on mutual aid?
Yeah, I would just kind of echo what Don and Doug have been saying. Anecdotally, I can just provide some examples. And so there was a hurricane, I think it was Hurricane Ida in Louisiana, where New Orleans was severely affected, and it became like a gas shortage issue. The city also had an evacuation kind of occurring in different parishes. I called up Don, and then we also knew someone from Walmart, and these are stores and buildings that are all in the same city. And we asked each other, like, hey, like, how do we try and get gas to come into this area? Because one, we need to help our own employees to reopen the warehouses as well as the grocery stores. So we're all kind of sharing our own, hey, this is the gas partner that I work with. Is it the same one as you? Do you know someone else? So we're sharing information like that. Another example is during COVID, when the restaurant industry kind of shut down, given some of the mandates that were coming out, we proactively reached out to the restaurant business, the restaurant industry, and asked them, like, is there a way that we can kind of share resources? Because we're getting inundated, but now they have employees that could be furloughed or laid off at the time. So we actually had selectors who worked at Cisco come to our warehouses and kind of help in that aspect too. Same thing with drivers, kind of sharing those type of resources. So when I mentioned we had like new partners from COVID, this is also something that we kind of have going forward. And then the last example is ISAC. It's a information technology focused group that really shares any cyber threat to the agriculture and food industry. So this is where the really smart IT people kind of come together, and they share like this is what I'm seeing as threats. This is the coding. This is the network that we're kind of seeing. And so that again is, you know, private companies who are competitors being open about this is something that's important to the industry and to the community, and we need to like make sure that we're protected against this.
Yeah, I love all of those examples and everything that you guys are saying, because it is, you know, it is not us against each other, but us against the crisis. So really terrific stuff. You know, someone used the big hairy issue term, and I'll just say to our audience members, we're closing in on our kind of our prepared questions, and we really want to hear from you. I know we have at least one or two questions in the Q&A already, but if you have questions for the panelists, we'd love to hear them. So kind of last prepared question for the panel here is, you know, let's look a little more broadly at the food supply chain for a minute. Jean, you mentioned climate change. That's certainly one of the things that's affecting us, but there are lots of other just significant changes in how and where we grow our food. And how and where we distribute our food, and all of those things. I think there's change all across the supply chain. So let's talk, I guess, just briefly about some of the causes of those shifts, climate change being one of them. And what does that mean for resilience? Or, you know, we're here to talk about resilience of supply chains. What does that mean for the resilience of our food supply chains? Anybody want to jump in on that one first?
I can kick us off.
Great,
Kathy.
Go ahead, Doug.
The one thing that I would ask everybody to sort of envision is, remember the day when you couldn't get a strawberry or a stone fruit in the wintertime? And then we started bringing stuff from warmer climates during the winter, and we started enjoying, you know, grapes and plums at times of years and strawberries at times of years we didn't. That wasn't technology. That was a supply chain that was bringing that to us. But over the course of time, technology is really starting to take place. And, you know, we're seeing vertical farms that were sort of like predisposing that we were going to need to learn how to feed a much more crowded planet, a much hotter planet with finite resources. And then you hit the pandemic and everything just accelerates. And then you see climate change somewhat accelerating again. And the Salinas Valley, you know, from the Colorado River starting to struggle. And I think, you know, we're going to be getting really creative as to how we bring food to market. Is there going to be a day where we don't see leafy greens growing in the Salinas Valley? You know, at the pace that we're going today, you'd have to say, yeah, it might not be in our lifetime, but you'd have to say, yeah, will we see leafy greens being grown in a, you know, 5-story building in Indianapolis, Indiana in the middle of the winter? Yeah, we probably will. But the neat thing is that for just about any one of our issues that we're facing, technology is sort of underpinning what those potential solutions can be. And so I think it's going to be extremely important. We must, as a society, be willing to talk about technology and food in the same sentence. And so as we learn how to use technology to improve our yields and grow our food and get more to the table, we're going to have to be really open-minded to that and not put some sort of baggage that we've learned several years ago into the middle of the conversation.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Jean, you want to jump in next?
Yeah, I think, and I'm going to kind of use it in context of other supply chains. When you look at the trend right now of, the de-globalization, the onshoring, the friendshoring of unlinking from people that we might not be friends with as much as we were at one time, you see that happening with the production of other things. But we're lucky enough in the United States to be very blessed with, an abundance of growth, ability, and potential that we probably are not as challenged as some of the other parts of the world trying to feed 1.x billion people and importing a lot of your food, or in the Ukraine and Russia, the disruptions that occurred because of the war. So I think you might see our food supply chain, our food chain, if you will, even becoming more friend-shored, looking to our friends to the north and south, and more those that we can trust as allies and friends, as opposed to trying to get things from other parts of the world that may not be as stable. And that's a trend with manufacturing. I don't know if we'll see that with this food supply chain also.
Great. Thanks, Jean. Don, your thoughts on what's changing our supply chains and the resilience thereof?
Yeah, and I think I mentioned it, whatever side of the climate equation that you're on, what caused it, it's not reality or whatever, it appears that there's a climate change. And that takes me back to what I said earlier about becoming better stewards of what we have already. And, when you have customers and they want it, they know what they want and when they want it, and it's usually now, and they want it fresh, that's going to drive some change. So the discussions are taking place, whether you may realize it or not. And, you think big companies, and we're dealing with the national brands, and something actually we just announced that we're doing is we're actually reaching out to some of the smaller local growers and suppliers in different areas to look for alternate sources, making, if you want to use the term, kind of a national brand out of these collectively, out of these local suppliers. I mean, that's kind of how organic grew, and I kind of put that pun in there. But the organic market kind of developed along that line. And could we take a lot of smaller as alternatives and make mini smalls to become a big thing? We're also looking at how can we help them compete in the complex supply chain area, especially when margins are still tight. They're so tight in our sector, and it makes it difficult if we can help them overcome that hurdle. We're also looking at alternatives. Now, I personally don't care for some of the avocado alternatives. I'm sorry, it just doesn't taste like guacamole, but we're at least we're tasting and we're trying. And then other things, we're improving existing food or process. And I think in that area, I think of food banks where donations were at the end of a product life cycle, but because of the way we're using product in the stores, like before the avocados go bad, we make guacamole out of it and sell guacamole, and it may not get to those less fortunate individuals. But we're looking at, can we change the process? So on some of the product, we're saying, if we freeze it, we can stop the clock and we can get it to people that can use that in a bit that had been depending on it and make good use of it. Again, kind of the good steward, getting some use out of it before it ends up in the trash or the landfill and stuff like that.
Yeah, Don, I'm actually facilitating a conversation with a couple of food bank folks tomorrow, and certainly the efficiencies that the retail sector has gained, and the fact that more people are eating food at home and buying from grocery stores has had an impact on their supply chain. So Carmela, you get the last word here again on this conversation around changing, supply chains in the food world and changing our resilience. What say you?
Yeah, the kind of closing comment I would say is both on the private and public sector side is, where are you going to invest some of this funding and money towards for innovation? It's not going to come, real quick. And so I think that's what we kind of think about is, a lot of the attendees here are emergency managers, and you guys know, like, $1 prevention is worth more than $1 in response. And so I think the industry and some of the government partners need to really think about that, because what we're doing today is not going to get us where we need to be tomorrow. So,
yeah, that's a great summary there. We've got probably about 20 minutes or so for questions. So, and we have quite a few in the Q&A section, but I do want to highlight just a couple of the comments that are in the chat about, back to our partnership and relationship conversation. It's not, just what you know, but who you know. Also a comment about, egg shortages or egg prices. Seems to be something we see every day. And then Doug, a call out to your PB&J graphic, which I love. I'm a fan of that graphic, and thanks for putting that in the chat so everyone can access that. So just some questions that are coming from our audience. I'm going to start with one that's a pretty quick one. Carmela, someone asked about the ISAC acronym and what that stood for. And if you could just maybe take a minute or so and talk about ISACs.
I will admit I have to look it up myself.
Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Yeah.
Yes, I talk in so many acronyms that I really can't tell everyone what it fully stands for.
Yeah.
But it is a membership, and so CNS has been in it within, I want to say, the last 6 to 8 months. And we've found it fruitful. So it's not just me and Katie from a business continuity side. We also have some of our IT partners in as a part of the group. They're definitely sharing things that I don't see through my normal channels of information pushes. Separately, we haven't really touched on that in this particular panel. There is more legislation or just talk about resiliency and what that actually means. And so, for example, like President Biden has an emergency order about supply chain resilience, and so required that some of his agencies go out and look into it, which starts having the food industry think about, well, what could come down after the Colonial Pipeline shutdown. I forget who oversees them, but they basically came out with some requirements right after that attack that they now must follow. And so there was a request for proposal that came out that ISAC as a group is kind of trying to engage with the government, kind of saying, this is what we kind of might see coming down, it's helpful. This would be where we might push back and say it's burdensome to the industry. Kind of falls where Doug is saying about traceability, just really going through the entire food supply chain is pretty complex. And again, Doug, Don, and I just kind of represent a very small bit of the entire landscape.
Great.
But you know what? Let me look
ahead.
it up, and I will jump it in the chat.
Well, and Doug just put in the retail and hospitality ISAC into the chat window. So I don't know if you participate in a different ISAC or not, but that is certainly a good place to start. Okay, a few other questions here. Let's start with this top one. Charlotte asks, how can a housing first policy towards the unhoused improve the challenges? I know someone mentioned the New York population of unhoused. How can a housing first policy, if anyone, I know we're not housing people, but if anyone wants to jump in and answer that.
One thing that we do when we have disasters is we always look at internally our employees. And we can't ask about everybody, but we have to start somewhere. And it's always about being safe and stable. And safe and stable could be in a shelter, but primarily it's people that have lost their belongings or have lost their house. That's such a basic need that individuals have. And when, again, let's focus on people. And it's interesting because, I'm headquartered right next door to Oregon, who just declared an emergency for houselessness. It's a big problem. And, day after day, because I'm also part of our foundation process, I just see the challenges of people that are living from paycheck to paycheck. And they can't even afford to live in the areas that they work any longer. I think it's a big unsettlement to our society. And I wish I had the answer. I just know it is so important. And I'm glad that somebody brought that out, because it's your shelter, it's your food and water. It's the utilities, the bare things. What are the bare things that you need to exist as a person in our community?
Yeah. Great answer, Don. Thank you. Anyone else want to just say anything about housing first policy? We're not housing experts, so don't feel like you need to.
Hey,
Okay.
Kathy.
Yeah, go ahead, Gene.
I'll add something. I mean, when you look at the first two questions, they kind of have some synergy to them with housing first, and I'm not a housing person, but I will say that I remember the tour that you took me on at the Feeding America tour down in Houston to that food bank, and that was an eye-opening experience to see the industrial level, production and packaging of that food for people that may not have a place to live, or maybe they do and they're just food insecure. But food insecurity and equity is a big thing with FEMA right now, and recognizing that our ability to provide food and water and other things through the relief supply chain is very minimal compared to what the private sector has. So we need to target it to the most at-risk population. So we're using a lot of different things through GIS and so forth, different algorithms to determine what that is. I mean, you have the SVI, the Social Vulnerability Index that CDC uses, but you also have other indices and other factors that go into looking at a disaster and where are the most at-risk people. It could be because they don't have their water up, their water systems. We saw that in Florida. Water, access to water, bulk water is becoming a really big deal in almost all the disasters. So I think those two kind of go together. I don't know what the solution is for homelessness, but we have to support the institutions that are trying to deal with that problem. The food banks and pantries are one of the things that we target a lot.
Absolutely.
And I would just tag on to Gene's statement, and the technology that supports their access to those things like SNAP and EBT, and making sure that the underserved populations can have as much access to what they need as somebody that doesn't have issues from a monetary standpoint or economic standpoint.
Kathy, can I add just one thing I think is really cool? And Don and Carmela probably haven't heard it yet, but at the White House Conference on Nutrition and Hunger, the grocery industry committed to the White House to deliver 2 billion meals to underserved individuals in the country. So again, it just goes to show that, they take care of their customers coming in the stores every day, and they still have time to think about the people that aren't as quite as well off as those that are coming into the stores. So
That's great, Doug. I had not heard that either. So great number to know. So I want to ask a little bit of a different question here, moving away from kind of the conversation around equity and unhoused, but this is more about your business and learnings, and it comes from Scott. And Scott asked, how do you approach the question of lessons learned and expectations, but at the same time also avoid blind spots and surprises? And Carmela, maybe we can hear from you on this first.
That's a good question. And so I think Katie and I follow a very emergency management planning cycle model where when there is a big event, we do a post-mortem. In our company, we treat holidays as a disaster. Holidays are one of the biggest pushes for the grocery industry because everyone wants to be around their family members and cook home cooked meals. And so we have daily calls, and then after the holiday is over, we go out to everyone and we say, this is what Katie and I are doing. We observed this. We think this is a recommendation. And then we have some leaders that also agree or not agree. And then they also kind of add in more things that their teams might have seen. But now we've gotten the company used to this model where it's like, we're going to do intense kind of response, a daily call. And then we're going to go through this kind of after action postmortem. And so this upcoming holiday, we share the stuff that we saw last year and say, don't forget. And we also include external factors. And so an external factor for us is, the cold vortex that kind of went across the entire country over Christmas. And, we might have had a couple like IT issues here or there, but that's just something to kind of think about. And when they start seeing this every year, it's like, wow, we always have like a large amount of external factors that affect what is our normal planning about forecasting the volume that we think customers are wanting. So I think you will always have surprises to answer the question because you can never really project how you're going to go through the event itself. But I think just adding some order to the chaos, which again, this is let's be open and talk about what we could do better for the next time, is a good thing to put in play.
Yeah. Don, you want to add in there?
Yeah, I would just say, the only true exercise is an actual event. And we go through it, and it's sharing that knowledge, and we get surprised, or maybe it's more, we should say, surprised it happened there because we would expect it someplace else. And I was thinking back to Hurricane Ian, where it hit the Gulf Coast as a hurricane, and we had the typical hurricane stuff that we did, and we responded to it. But then it exited through my mid-Atlantic region as a flooding event. And so, we have our local emergency response teams. We get them together when we have these events, and we talk about the nature of how these things happen, and not to be surprised, but be watching. So, I think that's the important part is you don't close your eyes, you don't turn your back on the events, but take the learnings. So now we've got information, should it be a hurricane event or should it be a flooding event? And we keep those as best practices. And then we really strive to have a one best method from all of our areas, but with the latitude that if Mother Nature kicks something different to you, you can respond to it. And unfortunately, we've had a lot of experience dealing with this. So I don't know if practice makes perfect, but at least our commitment, because our commitment is to people, associates, customers, and community. And what is it that they need prior to an event, during the event, after the event? And that kind of solves, I wouldn't say that there was anything extraordinarily new, because when Carmela was talking about the gas lead in the Louisiana area, we had actually done that type of an event 10 years before. Well, what we're finding, and it's capturing that knowledge, I was part of that event 10 years earlier on the ground. And it's like, hey, this is what we did. When we go into an area and we don't have potable water, good water stops food preparation operations. So now we're bringing in feed tankers to water our stores or pressurize our stores so we can continue on the services. So it's like all these different things that we see. And one of the alerts I watch is boil water orders, because who can predict where we're going to have one. So keep your eyes on the ball is really what it is, and realize the impact to your organization.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what I'm hearing from both of you is don't just observe your lessons, write them down, and then refer to what you've learned. Doug or Jean, anything you guys want to add on the question about lessons learned and expectations, but avoiding blind spots?
I can go, Doug. So I think one thing from you know, where I sit is you know, trying to get a better systems level understanding of kind of these super nodes that appear, these bottlenecks that are planned. One for Ian that we had our eye on, that we were very concerned about, that you guys, it's near and dear to your heart too, is the I-4 corridor from Tampa to Orlando, where you have a major clustering of distribution centers of all kinds. And you also have the only pipeline that feeds the Orlando region and everything that goes there. We were really focused on that as that hurricane came up, and we looked at that as like the worst case scenario. And it was the worst case scenario for those that were in the path of the hurricane, not saying, I mean, it's a tragedy to anyone that gets hit with a hurricane of that magnitude. But we did know what that would do, and it would segment the peninsula. You know, it would kind of cut off Miami. It could cause a lot of other, even though Miami wasn't going to get hit by the hurricane, it could really isolate them and cut off most of the distribution nodes going south and cause a lot of problems that would be even worse. So I think we're trying to get ahead of the boom, if you will, for the kind of the notice events like hurricanes, and look at the path and say, okay, what is the worst case scenario and what can we do to guard and mitigate against that risk?
That's great. Hey, Doug, anything before we move to our last question?
I think you're free to move. These guys did a great job.
Well, then I will, I'll just say thank you to all of the panelists and to the audience for the incredible questions. This is kind of a lightning round question, you know, 30, 45 seconds or less. There was a study that was done after Hurricane Sandy that showed that the private sector capacity to feed communities is as much as 50 times that of what government and nonprofit capacity can provide combined. But if there's a catastrophic event, it's going to be all hands on deck, right? And we don't know what we don't know about what disruptions are going to happen. So think about everything we've talked about today. What's one thing that you want to leave the audience with that we, emergency managers, crisis responders, supply chain professionals, whatever role we have to play, what's one thing we should do right now today to ensure people get the nourishment that they need after the big one? And Don, I'm going to start with you, 30, 45 seconds.
Okay. You know, I think part of it is it's the getting together and let's talk, and don't just rely on me. Get my partners in crime together and we'll share our stories. And I always comes to mind is that my geographic division boundaries don't necessarily line up with city, county, and state. And we need to talk about that, because I respond in one manner and it may not be the way that you're expecting me to respond. But if we don't talk, you won't know.
Yeah, thanks, Don. Jean, one thing.
Being able to convene people that have equities and knowledge from the major players in the food supply chain in that given area, and to be able to look at ways to remove impediments from the government perspective to free up that capacity.
Great, thanks, Jean. Carmela, one thing.
I don't really have anything else to mention. I mean, it really is important to know who your players are in your local area and to make that first meeting worth their time, because if it doesn't go right, you're not going to see those private partners back, to be honest.
Yeah, great comment. And then Doug, you get the final word here. You're the association guy.
And you always, like one word, like I can do one word, Kathy.
Well, okay, one comment, 30 or 45 seconds. How's
Okay.
that?
I'd start with the word unity. Crisis amplifies competition or unification. Redundancy, and important for a resilient supply chain. But in other instances, redundancies put strain on resources. So put the redundancies where they'll help and remove them where they don't help. And then finally, to Don's point, talk, or I call it exercise. Having those conversations and walking through it. I'll leave a quote: "The body can't go where the mind has never been."
Terrific. Thank you to all of my panelists, and Laura, it is back to you.
Thanks to all the panelists. Thank you, Kathy, so much for moderating this panel. Just wanted to make a couple of quick announcements. As a reminder, you could visit us. You see the URL, the bottom left of my screen, ahc2023.com. If you would like to see the full agenda for the rest of today, as well as the next 2 days. And also that is going to be the website where we'll place the track information or the Zoom link information to get to the tracks for tomorrow. I wanted to also remind you that after each session, you'll be seeing a link come through the chat that is a online survey. If you could just take a minute to answer the couple quick questions we're asking about these sessions and let us know how it went for you, we'd really appreciate it.